Barry, I would be a general practitioner with over 30 years experience, and over the years I've had a particular interest in two aspects of mental health. Firstly, how basically it affects people. I'm particularly interested in the areas of anxiety, that's both acute anxiety like panic attacks and phobias, and general anxiety, social phobias, and I have a special interest as well in depression. In fact, I'm one of the board members of our national organisation for depression here in Ireland. And I suppose the book was written due to a particularly tragic occurrence in my own town here in Drogheda. My first book came out in 2007. And a couple of years before that, a young boy took his own life in the most tragic way in Drogheda, where the body was unfortunately went into the river and was not found for quite a long time, coming up eventually on Christmas Eve. An absolutely tragic kind of story. And it kind of brought to a head for me, how so many people are getting so distressed from both panic attacks, anxiety and depression. The great word for me is to normalize these conditions, because there is such fear and misunderstanding and apprehension about all these terms and labels like depression and anxiety. What do they actually mean? And the second great area of mine for many, many years, I've been fascinated by the area of neuroscience, how the brain works. And I'm particularly interested in what we call the plasticity of the brain, which is, why do we get these conditions to start with? What happens? What kind of changes do we get in the brain? What kind of connections and pathways are affected by our genes and upbringing? And also, more importantly, how do all the particular therapies work? What are they actually doing in the brain? Because that's the secret, really. Once you begin to understand what happens to us as people and what's going on in that little box upstairs, and how they're both intimately connected, whether we like it or not, what it does is it kind of brushes away all the misunderstandings and confusions, because it can all be reduced to very, very simple ideas. Our brain is an incredibly simple organ, and maybe I'll share with you one wonderful concept that for me is at the heart of all of mental health. That is that we have at the front of our brain what I call our logical brain. It makes up 1/3 of our brain, and its basic task is to kind of be logical and reasonable and control our emotions and control our behavior. And in the middle of our brain is an area called the limbic system, which is really our emotional brain. And a very famous scientist looked at connections between these two, and to his great surprise discovered that the connections from the emotional brain were much, much stronger to the logical brain than in reverse. And this, of course, this had huge implications for how we understood mental health, because all of us, when we go through every day, everything that happens to us is a mixture of emotion and logic, and they're both in harmony. So sometimes we'll do things very emotionally, and sometimes we'll do them very logically. In America, for example, suppose America loses the Ryder Cup, and there's a tremendous feeling of sadness. Or Europe loses the Ryder Cup, and there's an even greater feeling of sadness over here. But what happens is our emotional brain goes into this kind of sadness for a couple of days, but then our logical brain begins to switch on, and our logical brain begins to say, but there's always 2 years' time. Do you know what I mean? So what we do is we rationalize the emotion. But what happens when we become unwell, and this is the secret to panic attacks and to anxiety and to depression, is that the emotional brain goes into negative mode. It literally goes into pure negative mode, and the logical brain loses its normal ability to regain control. And that, believe it or not, is at the heart of panic attacks, it's at the heart of depression, those two illnesses in particular, and anxiety in general. So if we could kind of understand that the secret is that any therapy that can reorganize that balance will work.
Yeah.
And so what I did, for example, flagging the therapy, I explained how all the varying therapies affected the emotional and logical brain. The whole key is to kind of dampen down the emotional brain, strengthen up your logical brain, and get them back in harmony again. And I think nothing probably shows that more acutely than, for example, a panic attack. In a panic attack, our whole emotional brain goes into total negative mode, And unfortunately, our emotional brain is in charge of our whole stress system. So when that happens, our whole stress system becomes completely hyped up.
Mm-hmm.
And our logical brain nearly gets swamped because our emotional brain begins to kind of feel that something terrible is going to happen. I'm going to die, I'm going to have a heart attack, I'm going to have a stroke. And the emotional brain can be so strong in these circumstances. It can just absolutely flood our logical brain. So even though deep down, somewhere inside of our brain, we kind of know in our heart and soul that we're not going to die and that we're not going to have a heart attack, our emotional brain is so strong that it still swamps that logic. And of course, that's why people become so frightened of panic attacks. And similarly, in depression, what happens is that the emotional brain, due to kind of, there are connections between the emotional and logical brain, and we now know from a lot of neuroscience that what happens in depression is that these connections actually go down.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is when we come under stress, our mood can fall, and once again our emotional brain is swamps our logical brain, and our logic brain can't switch it off. So to me, this is so exciting because if we understand this ability of the emotional and logical brain to actually change and particularly alter its what we call its plasticity by varying therapies, we can restructure these pathways again and regain control and get things back into kind of balance again. So that concept, believe it or not, from a clinical point of view and from a neuroscience point of view, should lie at the very heart of our understanding of why we get these conditions, and most of all, what therapies work and what don't.